in our final session, Fascist Empires. And we have first Pamela Ballinger, who's professor of history and the Fred Cuny Chair in the History of Human Rights at the University of Michigan. She's the author of History and Exile, Memory and Identity at the Borders of the Balkans, and The World Refugees Made, Decolonization and Foundation of Post-War Italy. Her research focuses on refugees and human rights, migration, seascapes, empire and decolonization, and borderlands. She's currently at work on 2 book projects, An Intimate Sea, Sovereignties, Cartographies, and Nature along the Modern Adriatic, and Materializing Mussolini's Mediterranean, Infrastructure of Fascist Empire. Pamela will be followed by Giuliana Chamedes, who is Mellon Mortgage Associate Professor of History at Madison. Her first book, A 20th Century Crusade, The Vatican's Battle to Remake Christian Europe, explores right-wing religious internationalism, epistemic hegemony, and the reinvention of Europe after World War I. Book 2 is in progress. It's called Unpaid Debts, European Socialists, the Global South, and the Struggle for Economic Decolonization. Okay, she's also, and I was noticing in the last panel and listening to people's bios, a lot of people are doing collaborative work, and that's true of Giuliana as well. She's working on two co-edited and co-written projects, it seems. She will be joining us by Zoom. And then Roberta Pergher is Associate Professor of History at Indiana University. Her book, Mussolini's Nation, Empire, Sovereignty and Settlement in Italy's Borderlands, 1922 to 1943, appeared with Cambridge University Press in 2018. Her co-edited volume in the Society of Fascists was published in 2012, and a second co-edited volume, Beyond Versailles, appeared in 2019. She is now writing a book on citizenship under fascism, and we're going to proceed in the way that we have. There will be the first paper of about 40 minutes, followed by 2 20-minute responses. Pamela.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the organizers for the invitation. I was actually telling Skye on the bus this morning that it was either 1990 or 1991, and between undergraduate and graduate, that I met both George Mosse and Emilio Gentile, and I understood that they were important, but of course, being 21, I didn't really understand how important they were, and so many questions that I wish I had asked them and are now in my mind, of course. So, but this is a really wonderful occasion. So what defines fascist empire? What are its distinctive repertoires of rule, as well as its self-characterizations? What distinguishes it from its modern liberal imperial counterparts? Such questions, we know, did not preoccupy the luminaries who gathered at Stanford in 1963 to debate and define fascism. 60 years on, scholars have rectified this with an expansive and expanding body of literature investigating aspects of fascist empire and looking at everything from racial politics to citizenship to public works and other infrastructural initiatives to environmental impacts to economic policies, especially autarky and militarization. Yet this work on fascist empire all too frequently remains set off from the burgeoning work on empire, particularly the new imperial history. Or to be more accurate, scholarship on fascist imperium tends to engage in a one-way dialogue with the non-fascist empire literatures, drawing from their insights, but rarely influencing paradigms that are still focused on France and Britain, and increasingly those of the continental and dynastic Habsburg and Ottoman empires. Of course, one of the many challenges, or at least for me, in conceptualizing fascist empire is that arguably both elements of the term are essentially contested concepts, so we compound the dilemmas when we join them together. As the organizers of this event have noted, the fragile consensus about what was fascism has been unsettled by the urgent questions of what is fascism in our present moment, as well as new interpretive frameworks like global history and transnational history. In order to focus my discussion today of fascist imperialism, I'm going to consider only the principal members of the Axis, Italy, Germany, and Japan. I'm an Italian specialist, so these are the dangers of comparison. I hope others will join in with their areas of expertise. And also, I'm very curious to hear about other regimes that potentially fall under the label of fascist that we haven't talked about yet, right? The Ustasha, the Iron Guard, and so on. I use the term Axis as a convenient shorthand for the three countries, and I'm well aware that this is anachronistic for the period before 1936-1937. I'm also well aware that the question of Japan's fascism, both its nature and its extent, remains hotly debated. As Ricky Kirsten flatly puts it, asking, was Japan fascist in the 1930s and 1940s, we enter into a conceptual quagmire. Nonetheless, scholars have recently initiated productive discussions, both comparing and teasing out the entangled projects of fascism at work among the Axis partners, particularly in regards to imperialism and then decolonization. Let me offer just a few examples. Daniel Hedinger has documented the 1938 mission by the Italian Fascist Party to Japan's metropole and its imperial territories in Manchukuo, Korea, and China. He concludes that at this moment in time, the Italians were more proactive than their German allies in forging an East Asian policy, even as fascist officials, like Enrico Paolucci, contended that the Japanese had pioneered implementation of an imperial new order that initially had been prophesied by Mussolini. Patrick Bernhard has instead argued that Nazi plans for settler colonialism in Eastern Europe drew heavily upon the example of fascist schemes in East Africa and Libya, as Nazi officials like Himmler and associations such as the German Colonial Society, the Italo-German Cultural Society, and the German Geographical Society studied the Italian imperial blueprint closely. These debates put into question cliches about the Italians as junior partners in their alliance with Nazism, and they also raise important questions about periodization, given the non-coterminous nature of fascism and imperialism in each of the respective contexts. For leaders and citizens of Italy, Germany, and Japan, imperial aspirations and experiences did not originate with the militaristic fascist states of the interwar, nor, of course, did these later imperial formations exist in a vacuum. Rather, they came into being in a world of global capitalism dominated by empires and what our colleague Roberta Pergher has so usefully called nation empires. One of the many important insights of global perspectives has been to remind us of the trans-imperial context marked by both competition and collaboration in which all colonial ventures unfolded, as well as the complex and multi-directional flows between metropoles and empires, including those between other powers, metropoles, and colonial territories. We can think, for example, of Gekas and Baruta's useful notion of the modern Mediterranean as a colonial sea. I never remember how to get these, there we go. Intersect by crisscrossing flows of labor, capital, and ideas. This was a sea, for example, in which Italian subjects, variously understood in terms of ethnicity, language, kin networks, or citizenship, always proved more numerous in the colonies of other powers like Tunisia, Algeria, and Egypt than in Italy's own overseas territories. Alternatively, Gilchrist's analysis of British and Italian intelligence networks in the in Palestine Mandate demonstrates another type of shared or inter-imperial space, albeit a fragile one, that was filled with tension. These approaches demand, as Gilchrist puts it, that we go beyond, quote, the single axis approach to studying empire, end quote. So here, pun intended, I situate Axis imperial ambitions and practices within a global view that incorporates both trans-imperialism and transnational fascism. So because of the complexity of a discussion like this and the shortness of my time, I'm going to focus more on inter-imperiality across the axis, and I know that this is an artificial distinction because, of course, these colonial ventures are unfolding within a global context. And I'm also going to focus on commonalities more than differences between the respective fascist empires. While I don't have time here to dig into the lively scholarly debates about continuities and discontinuities between pre-fascist and fascist colonialisms, let me adopt Reto Hoffman's useful phrasing in acknowledging fascist empire as a paradoxically new old order, one that rested, as he puts it, on the bedrock of liberal imperialism. In their ideology and propaganda, however, The Axis regimes stressed the newness and difference of their empires from those of the classic Western great powers, and to varying degrees, their own earlier respective colonial experiments. The Tripartite Pact explicitly enshrined the mutual respect between Italy and Italy and Germany for Japan's new order in Asia, and in turn, Japan's recognition of fascist new orders in Europe. In light of these ideological self-depictions, I propose here that we might consider fascist imperialism as entailing a type of imperial excess, or to put it a little differently, as constituting an empire of excess. Now, I'm acutely aware of the risk that this may replicate the pathologizing or anomalizing depictions of fascist empire. While gesturing towards these views and taking them into account, however, I'll try to draw upon multiple meanings of the word excess in ways that I hope stress the particularities of fascist empire at sites at which broader imperial practices and repertoires become more pronounced and yet at other moments depart from custom, which is an obsolete meaning of excess. In synthesizing a series of debates here, ongoing debates, I aim to highlight more recent work, notably studies of fascist political economy, infrastructure, and fascism's socio-ecological metabolism. So much of this scholarship follows out of the kind of material turn that followed the linguistic and cultural emphases on political ritual and spectacle that redefined fascism studies really through the work of Mosse and others. So one meaning of excess is a leftover of sorts. Italy, Germany, and Japan have all been considered latecomer states, right, owing to Italy and Germany's formation as states in the second half of the 19th century, and Japan's belated modernization and opening to the West in the same time period. Now, if we leave aside the problematic normative assumptions that inhere in such terms, I'd like to instead underline the expressed sense of grievance about territorial goodies having already been apportioned out that informed many nationalist and later fascist calls for imperial expansion in these states. And I know yesterday there was an interesting discussion about the relationship between nationalism and fascism, which is, I think, hotly debated within Italian historiography at the moment. In all three contexts, there arose a rhetoric that positioned these states as disadvantaged proletarian nations, and their would-be nation empires as distinct and distinctly more virtuous from hegemons like France or Great Britain. In liberal Italy, the most vocal enunciation of such ideas came from nationalists like Enrico Corradini, one of the founders of the Italian Nationalist Party. At this party's first Congress in 1910, Corradini gave an address on the theme of classi proletarie, socialismo, nazione proletaria, nazionalismo. So he laid out a vision of a world divided between have and have-not nations as well as classes, and declared Italy is materially and morally a proletariat nation. The post-World War I settlements, of course, fueled and deepened sentiments of grievance about being a have-not power or being relegated to imperial leftovers. A defeated Germany, of course, lost its colonial possessions in Africa and the Pacific, in addition to struggling under the weight of war reparations and debt. Whereas Italy fought on the side of the victorious Allied powers, it failed to achieve several of the territorial gains that had been promised in the 1915 Treaty of London, which was a secret treaty, as promises for Habsburg and Ottoman imperial territories ran up against the realities of Wilsonian self-determination. Although not among the lands promised by the treaty, the Adriatic port city of Fiume, or Rijeka, occupied for 19 months by the poet Gabriele D'Annunzio and his legionnaires, became the symbol and flashpoint of Italy's so-called mutilated victory, which Brian mentioned yesterday. In Asia, by contrast, notions of self-determination generated powerful anti-colonial critiques. Asian nationalists, including those in Japan, quote, called out the imperialism of so-called free trade and condemned white supremacy on the world stage, end quote. This is from Louise Young. Japanese imperialists would thus harness anti-colonialism to their claims of pioneering a new form of non-Western, non-racist imperialism. Mark Peaty sees something peculiar or particular in the Japanese case, arguing, quote, the first and most arresting aspect of the Japanese empire is the fact that the metropolitan homeland itself only narrowly escaped colonial subjugation, surviving as one of the 4 Asian nations to escape obliteration in the flood of Western dominance in the 19th century. As it was, and this is still Peaty, Japan's emergence as a colonial power in the late 1890s came just as the nation was extricating itself from the unequal treaty system imposed 3 decades earlier by the Western powers, end quote. Yet, I would say there's nothing anomalous or exceptional about this. Italy's unification, for example, was premised upon its liberation from various foreign powers, which in turn gave rise to demands for external colonies alongside irredentist claims for territories that were still then controlled by the dual monarchy, but were supposedly yearning to be joined with the Madre Patria. Bresciani has persuasively argued for understanding Italy as a successor state of the Habsburg Empire, for example, highlighting the role of the Upper Adriatic lands that Italy acquired in the wake of the Habsburg polity's dissolution as a laboratory for paramilitary fascist violence. Multiple historical experiences of political division or subjection thus informed the ideologies of aggrievement underwriting claims to the right to rule over other peoples. This stands in contrast to ideologies of anti-colonial solidarity that one might expect in light of such historical experiences in the pervasive proletarian language. The gap between theory and practice was stark in all 3 situations, but perhaps most striking in the Japanese case. Here, imperialism built upon traditions of anti-colonial nationalism, as Manchukuo became positioned as the exemplar of a putative imperialism without colonies, and of a multi-ethnic polity characterized by racial harmony. While breaking with European-style models of race, Japan's empire nonetheless reinscribed the politics of difference as it tacked between, quote, inclusionary gestures and its efforts to control indigenous populations throughout the empire via the production of racialized sound and space, and again, quoting Louise Young. The language of have-not nations would come to populate interwar social, scientific, and economic analyses of national development and was popularized through the reports of the League of Nations, which looked at things like standard of living, food security, raw materials, and natural resources in these assessments. Although specific claims for why such states needed and deserved colonies often rang hollow, when confronted with Italian aggression in Ethiopia and Nazi demands for colonies, in 1937, the League took up a previous proposal and established a commission to investigate the question of commercial access for all nations to certain raw materials. At the same moment in time, historian and Chatham House director Arnold Toynbee proposed internationalizing colonial control. While Toynbee was aiming to diffuse revisionist tensions, advocates of a renewed German colonialism saw in his ideas the possibility of regaining lost territories. During the interwar period, the hopes of a German colonial lobby existed alongside and increasingly looked to Nazism, whose vision of Lebensraum, particularly after the Anschluss, focused on territorial expansion within the European continent. Scholars have spent a lot of time debating the relationship between these 2 separate but related models of imperialism, with German dreams of a renewed Middle Africa remaining just that, dreams. But recently, Andrew Denning has questioned a predominant thesis that supposedly Nazi overseas colonialism was largely strategic, admitting that with the onset of the war, as he puts it, the pursuit of continental Lebensraum eclipsed overseas Weltpolitik. Denning contends that Nazism nonetheless dedicated significant resources to planning for a future empire that encompassed Africa. Italian fascist diplomats like Raffaele Guariglia and officials Francesco Saverio Caracelle likewise imagined Eurafrica as a site at which Axis vital spaces would intersect and reinforce one another. In such a vision, the Mediterranean was a kind of hinge between fascist empires in Europe, Africa, and Asia. When viewed through the lens of global fascism, German, Italian, and Japanese conceptualizations of living space and Europe and Africa are thus revealed as intertwined. And indeed, all 3 regimes were characterized by multiple models and moments of colonialism and imperialism, which brings us to our next meaning of excess, abundance. Fascist empire was characterized by sometimes competing, sometimes complementary dreams of establishing what scholars have variously called ethnographic or expatriate colonies versus colonies of formal domination. Oops, oh, I just did. In the Italian case, the oscillation between the 2 models dated back to liberalism and the conjunction of mass outmigration from the peninsula with military defeat in pursuit of formal colonies. In the wake of unification, leaders like Prime Minister Crispi had called for Italy to enter the colonialism game in Africa, seeing colonies as a solution to the dual problems of surplus population and the Southern question. Italians obtained their first colonial possessions in Africa in the 1880s, but imperial overreach led to military routes at the hands of Ethiopian forces at Dogali in 1887 and then Adwa in 1896. In the backlash to colonial ventures that followed these humiliations, liberals like Luigi Einaudi promoted an alternative form of colonialism. Flipping the script that portrayed immigration as both a cause and a symptom of weakness, Einaudi argued that informal colonies or communities formed by Italian migrants in places like the US or Argentina offered better means for promoting Italian interests abroad than did expensive formal colonies. Although jingoistic celebrations of Italian success in the Italo-Turkish War dimmed the appeal of this minority vision of a colonialism formed by expatriate communities, Mussolini and fascism would continue to nurture relationships with Italian expatriate colonies in the diaspora through means such as the fasci all'estero. Two geographies of German empire likewise animated expansionist visions in the interwar period, one calling for the return or restoration of former German colonial territories, and the other turning its eyes to Eastern Europe as the site of German vital living space. While we are most familiar, I found this map a bit funny, but while we are most familiar with the murderous campaign to cleanse Eastern Europe of its Jews, Slavs, and Roma to make way for both Volksdeutsch and Reichsdeutsch settlers, along with projects for Norway and Northern Europe, another model of economic penetration existed alongside it. In his 2015 monograph, Export Empire, Stephen Gross examines how German proponents of informal empire sought to use trade on the one hand and ethnic German communities on the other to promote German interests in southeastern Europe. Likewise, in his capacity as head of Germany's colonial department from 1924 to 1935, Edmund von Bucher organized the reacquisition of German plantations in Cameroon and Tanganyika. Buchner anticipated that League membership would permit Germany to economically penetrate these former territories with the hope that eventually they might be returned to Germany. But even where formal recolonization seemed impossible, officials like Buchner hoped through soft power and hard diplomacy to acquire authority over former colonies and territories in southeastern Europe with ethnic German populations. More radical visions, inspired in part by the fascist experience in Libya, like those of President of the German Geographical Society Oskar Schmieder, included repatriating some of the 1.2 million German emigrants in South America to people future African colonies. In Japan as well, former colonialism coexisted with efforts to turn emigrant communities into political and economic assets. As in Italy at the end of the 19th century, Japanese outmigration figured as a source of shame, especially with the spectacle of impoverished women turning to prostitution and Japanese migrants being subjected to discriminatory legislation in their host countries. Outspoken proponents of emigration like newspaper owner Fukuzawa Yukichi, however, dedicated their efforts to arguing that Japanese settlements abroad could serve Japan as an instrument for global competitiveness. While seeing migration as a solution to unemployment, Fukuzawa devoted particular attention to a form of what he called Japanese entrepreneurial migration, where Japanese immigrants would form trade networks in major US trading ports and provide a link to Japanese commerce. In the 1890s, Minister of Foreign Affairs Enomoto Takeaki created an immigration department to promote agricultural settlements abroad that would hopefully provide remittances and increase Japanese prestige. The language employed echoed the Italian terms colonie and coloni when used to refer to diaspora settlements. After leaving office, Enomoto oversaw a settlement society and the Japan-Mexico Colonization Company, although its accomplishments were modest. Migrants from Japan, Italy, and Germany who embodied alternative forms of colonial expansion, of course, would find themselves increasingly vulnerable as their ethnic homelands pursued more aggressive forms of outright imperialism in the 1930s. And as we know, in the United States, for the most part, during the war, only Italian and German aliens faced internment, whereas persons of Japanese descent, whether they were citizens or not, Nice and Ise, would face mass expropriation and internment. Now, come to another meaning of excess. Well, again, abundance. So the Axis empires consisted of a wide range of territories across Europe, Africa, and Asia that had varied juridical statuses. This was not distinctive of fascist empire, given the political unevenness of empire and what Lauren Benton has described as not covering space evenly, but a fabric full of holes stitched together out of pieces, a tangle of strings. In the Italian case, a strong racial hierarchy differentiated its European territories and their inhabitants from those of the African colonies, with gradated citizenship possible only in the former and colonial subjecthood in the latter. The exception before 1937 was for mixed-race children who had been recognized by their Italian fathers. This was always a very small category. These racialized distinctions were also reflected in administrative structures. So Italy administered Albania, which was a protectorate, and the Aegean Islands a possession through the Ministero degli Affari Esteri, whereas Libya and East Africa fell under the aegis of the Ministero delle Colonie and then Ministero dell'Africa Italiana after 1937. In their multiplicity, all three empires bore hallmarks of overseas empire on the one hand and continental empires on the other. Even archipelagic Japan directed much of its energies in the 1930s to continental interests, Korea, China, Manchuria. During the Second World War, of course, these regimes added massive amounts of territory to their empires. And scholars often differentiate formal empire from territories that were occupied during wartime, or at least the Second World War. And so I think this reinforces the hesitation many historians have had until recently to categorize the Nazi war machine in pursuit of the General Plan Ost under the label of colonial or imperial. But Davide Rodogno has demonstrated that for the Italian fascist empire, the ideology of spazio vitale rested on a vision of an Italian Mediterranean from which moved out concentric circles of control and cultural affiliation. So there was a so-called piccolo spazio, peopled by the Italian race, and then a larger encompassing grande spazio, populated by subject peoples, including those who it was anticipated would be brought under Italian rule through a global war. While reminiscent of the Nazi variant of Lebensraum, which of course predated the Nazi period, it goes back to Ratzel's ideas, fascist spazio vitale also echoed 19th century Japanese ideas about concentric circles of national interest that radiated outward and formed first a cordon of sovereignty and then a cordon of advantage. During the interwar period, German geographer Karl Haushofer's geopolitical working of the Lebensraum concept enjoyed tremendous popularity in Japan. So again, we see more of these transfers and entanglements. The unevenness of empire raises pressing questions about periodization, as well as the temporalities that inform fascist imperialism. In rereading the history of colonial products like bananas in Italian East Africa, Diana Garvin, who I have back here, underscores a long fascism that does not conform neatly to cardinal dates, as she puts it. Louise Young similarly questions the scholarly consensus that temporally brackets wartime empire for Japan and instead posits an expansionistic drive inherent to fascism and, as she sees it, more broadly to have-not ideologies of grievance. These questions are often wed to issues of scale and agency. So when we start talking about fascism from below versus above, movement versus state, movement versus regime, party versus state, and so on. And so these are kind of intertwined questions with periodization. In characterizing the Japanese fascist experiment as producing what she calls total empire, Young notes that despite her attempts to separate spatial and temporal spheres that constituted distinct imperial projects, quote, in the end, they were all Manchukuo. Herein lay the paradox at the heart of total empire. It was at once discrete and interconnected, plural and singular, methodical and random, overdetermined and contingent, end quote. Other aspects of fascist imperialism that appeared to mark a departure from custom, which is an obsolete meaning of excess, and I'll say more about it in a moment, include a political economy organized around corporativism, I always have trouble with that, corporativism, and autarky, tight controls on migration, and monumentalist infrastructure. There's a strong case to be made then for the ways in which some imperial sites in some moments served as critical labs or laboratories for distinctly fascist repertoires of rule, as well as for how a view from the peripheries can recast our interpretations of processes in the metropole. In the Italian case, the detailed investigation of racial logics in the overseas territories and the prohibitions there on interracial relationships prior to the 1938 racial laws targeting metropolitan Jews have debunked notions that racialism was merely an import from Nazi Germany, alien to Italian traditions. While attending to such departures from other colonial scripts, we must remain cautious about taking at face value the fascist claims to uniqueness, particularly when talking about imperialism. With Mussolini's proclamation of empire on the 9th of May, 1936, with the conquest of Ethiopia, the fascist leader trumpeted his empire as something different from capitalist colonialism. And this was a distinction that proved convenient after 1945, when even anti-fascist leaders argued without success that democratic Italy should be allowed to retain its pre-fascist African colonies. I mean, we'll leave aside the trusteeship in Somalia for a decade. But this is to point out that the question of periodization in the era of decolonization was not just an academic debate, right? It had very real political stakes. Furthermore, we might explore the multiple competing temporalities and time horizons at work in fascist imperialism as operating along the lines of what Gerolanos, Edelstein, and Wheatley have deemed chronosynosis. This is a concept that, as they see it, captures not just the multiplicity, but also the conflict of temporal regimes operating in any given moment. So they're looking at competitive temporal formations, not just merely parallel ones or the kind of palimpsest idea. While the reference to Romanità in Mussolini's proclamation of empire might suggest a mere rhetorical gesture, fascism made clear that it intended to build upon, but also exceed the accomplishments of ancient Rome. Fascist architects, for example, rewrote the cult of Romanness through modernist scripts at places like the Ayor Quarter or the Libyan coastal road. In places like Libya and the Aegean Islands, science became wed to colonial projects of recuperating the past, notably archaeology. Yet reading the ideological project of Mare Nostrum exclusively through the lens of Romanità neglects the bricolage of reference and historical experiences animating Italy's imperial imaginary, right? They inherited a whole set of juridical and administrative legacies from other empires. The Nazi Empire likewise invoked a multiplicity of historical or pseudo-historical reference and models, from Teutonic Knights to Vikings, Karl May fantasies of the American West to the Jim Crow South. So we come to another meaning of excess. Fascist empire claimed not only newness, despite its deep roots in previous colonial structures, but also superiority to other modes and models of governance. In celebrating a new old empire, for example, Mussolini and other propagandists described East Africa as an empire of work, impero di lavoro. While this echoed the notion of a proletarian imperialism, it also reflected the elaboration in Africa from 1930 onwards of corporativist models that were supposedly superior to capitalist colonialism. Germany and Japan likewise promoted forms of subtler colonialism intended to make new men and new women for new orders through radical and all-encompassing transformation of landscapes and their inhabitants. This last is a quote from Philip Lehman, Desert Edens. The tight circumscription of mobilities, both in the metropole and the colonies, and of both colonizers and colonized alike, but in different and varying degrees, reflects one excessive aspect of fascist new orders when we look at other contemporaneous empires. In the Japanese Empire, free movement was seldom taken for granted, whether for mainlanders or for colonial subjects. The Manchukuo state, for example, employed biometric technologies that had been imported from Germany, like fingerprint registration, in order to regulate its population. The Commissariato per l'Immigrazione e la Colonizzazione Interna in Italy regulated movement to the Italian colonies, but it was never successful in kind of stopping the leakage, especially of members of the Italian diaspora who moved in and out of the colonies. In places like Italian Libya, something as seemingly straightforward as traveling from a colonial village to give birth in a hospital in Tripoli required permission, And this led unruly settlers to constantly try to escape the restrictions on their mobility and labor. And other highly mobile subjects like ethnic Maltese, Greek, and Yemeni created similar headaches for fascist colonial authorities. Pastoralist and semi-pastoralist indigenous groups became the objects of brutal sedentarization campaigns. In keeping with the valorization of sedentarization and the peasant farmer, agricultural imaginaries received disproportionate attention in all three imperial contexts. The Japanese aim to send 1 million impoverished farmers to Manchuria echoed Italian fascism's hope of ridding the metropole of braccianti, or landless agricultural workers who had deep cultures and traditions of labor radicalism. And so they were sent to these quickly built new settlements in places like Libya. In both instances, these projects were positioned as alternative forms of agrarian modernization in a world reeling from the shocks of global depression. But despite the intensive propaganda around and the resources dedicated to farming settlements in places like East Africa, Libya, and Rhodes, part of a complex that Chinotto has said constitutes food imperialism and gastrofascism, Italian migrants overwhelmingly preferred life in the imperial city. So again, there was another form of constant leakage as people tried to leave these villages. In the case of National Socialism, it's a cliche to cite the centrality of the ideology of Blut und Boden, but there were dissenting voices within the movement, like that of Otto Strasser. Recent debates over the ecological motives and environmental consequences of Nazi expansion in the East, particularly the discourse addressing stepification or desertification, have offered new glosses on the multiple understandings of soil in the Nazi universe and on the entwined projects of agriculture, corporativism, and technoscience. In their pursuit of settler colonialism, fascist regimes were also empires of works, not just empires of work, but of public works. Infrastructural initiatives such as land reclamations, road building, and construction of agrarian settlements inscribed fascism onto metropolitan and colonial territories across the Axis. At the same time, these experiences transformed metropolitan assumptions and practices. Japanese engineers and builders adapted local materials, for example, like river gravel flagstone, in building an extensive road network in northeast China. The Italians embarked upon a massive road building campaign in Libya and Africa Orientale Italiana, whereas construction of the 1,000-kilometer Strada Litoranea along Libya's coastline marked the colony's unification and pacification, according to the regime. In East Africa, the Italians instead undertook the construction of an Eritrean road network connecting the highlands to the Red Sea in advance of the Ethiopian invasion. In Andrew Denning's estimation, here, quote, road construction was a precondition for military action in the region, and in its logistical complexity, a test run for the fascist state, end quote. Denning, like many other scholars, highlights the speed at which such infrastructural initiatives unfolded, with Italy compressing, or we could say accessing, thank you, colonial developments that span decades in other empires into a single decade in the 1930s. Such speed required extractive labor practices, ones that reached their most extreme form in the Nazi use of Jewish enslaved labor in places like Ukraine to build the roads and railway lines that would serve the campaign of Jewish annihilation. And these were also costly infrastructural projects, and the amount spent typically exceeded capital economic logics. So this has often been read as an example of the kind of irrational excess of fascism. But it definitely reflects fascism's own self-image as offering a third way, a different way, both politically and economically. So in the last phase of fascist imperialism, when imperial excess became ever more excessive, and we can see this in the expenditures of Italy in places like Libya and East Africa, advertising the virtues of fascism at home and abroad took precedence over the fiscal concerns that preoccupied capitalist bean counters. In the context of global depression and economic sanctions, such expenditures paradoxically deepen the need for autarky in the face of shortages or the fear of them. And autarky is another thing that wasn't specific, of course, to fascism, but had its roots in the First World War and the anti-global currents that flourished in its food insecure aftermaths. But again, we see excessive forms of autarky under fascist imperialism, which made autarky a key ideological principle and dedicated resources to developing alternative supply chains alongside new commodities. In the Italian case, the realities of colonial expansion often worked against autarkic goals, and this is seen in the massive importation of products like pasta and bottled water and canned food to its Italian territories. But of course, this benefited private companies like Barilla, whose manufacture of pasta for the empire boomed and made the empire consumable, in Garvin's words. So the profits of companies like Barilla and Fiat, Krupp and Volkswagen, the South Manchuria Railway Company, and Nissan remind us that despite fascism's claim to run and regulate a new type of imperial closed-looped economy, private industry remained critical to its operation. Autarkic self-sufficiency indexed the expansionist drive for new sources of materials and markets, and it thus also embodied a sense of excess understood as waste, together with the need to combat excess in its meaning of intemperance. This reached its extreme and extremist culmination, and I really will wrap up, Darcy, in what Anne Berg has characterized as Nazism's rag and bone economy. Berg unpacks National Socialism's obsession with waste and contamination, seen in murderous ideologies of racial purity, but also in everyday practices of rubbish collection and recycling. Recently, business historians have begun to reconsider transnational processes of waste collection and salvage during the war. Chad Denton has argued that Japanese regulations on Korean migrant scrap dealers took cues from Nazi initiatives. When compared to other fascist and authoritarian powers, even the horrors of the rag and bone economy, though, may reflect differences of degree more than kind. So I am coming to my conclusion and the final meaning of excess, the action of going beyond, extravagant violation of law, morality, outrageous conduct. Like all modern empires and nation empires, those of fascism were biopolitical projects focused on managing populations and territories. They rested upon racialized visions of the world in which the colonizers' bodies had to be improved and strengthened through positive eugenics and negative eugenics. These practices merged in the techniques of scientific fascism and colonialism, which sought to improve wombs and breast milk, engineer new strains of wheat and sheep, and pioneer new efficiencies of death. Thus, these were intensely corporeal regimes that strove to regulate everything from diet to gender roles, to sexual politics, to radio listening, as we've heard about today. Violence towards individual bodies and bodies politic always underlaid apparent forms of consensus. And it's this I'll close on, this point, the role of mass violence, how to categorize it, and whether it can or should be compared, that scholars have argued most fiercely about the nature of fascist imperialism. Okay, because of time and for many reasons, I don't want to go through the Historiker Streit debates and so on, but I do take as axiomatic, as this talk has suggested, that we need to compare fascist and other forms of colonial violence. And I think that global and transnational history have given us some new tools that help us to go beyond the old stalemates of that kind of relativizing argument debate from the 1980s. And I mean, the most current, and Omer Bartov, I don't know if he's here now, was sort of referencing this, right? I mean, is the very vexed catechism debate, or, the debate that Zimmerer says from Windhoek to Auschwitz, or what Italian historiography has called the colonial hypothesis, that asks about a transfer of techniques of repression between East Africa and European occupied territories like Yugoslavia, right? So can we talk about these as commensurate forms of violence, as entangled forms of violence, and so on? So while there's no real consensus on how to situate fascist empire within the framework of what are called extremely violent societies, I think most scholars agree on the excessive nature of National Socialism, not only in the quantity of victims and the means of violence, but also in the fact that Nazism carried out mass murder of its own citizens. And this is exactly what Omer was referencing this morning. At the time, this was, of course, well remarked upon at the time by people like Arendt, Césaire, Lemkin, and so on. They all noted the importation of colonial violence into the heart of Europe. So even if scholars continue to disagree about how to define the nexus of imperialist and fascist violence, No serious student of Nazism could ever entertain the absolutions inherent in the brava gente rhetoric that still is voiced at points in Italy, or Japanese revisionist rejection of claims about atrocities. And I realize that I'm, at the edge of this sort of treacherous, again, the catechism debate, but I think we don't need to rehearse it all here, but I hope those of you who have been engaged in that debate, especially in the German context, will weigh in here. So just to last thoughts. By employing the language of excess, I wish to keep us alert to, rather than numbed by the grotesqueness and criminality of such violence, especially including Italian and Japanese violence, which tends to still be relativized to that of the Nazis, even while signaling the scholarly hazards of running aground on the shoals of attempting to quantify or qualify violence. We will probably never satisfactorily answer the question of which regime or form of colonialism or fascism produced more violence or was singularly extreme. And I don't think when I look at the debate that unfolded recently, I'm not sure that these are also the most productive questions for us going forward. But I would argue instead, the notion of imperial excess attunes us to how fascist imperialism was always in dialogue with and built upon or imitated other models of territorial expansion and repertoires of racism and violence, fascist and non-fascist alike. As I've discussed, the term excess has many meanings: leftover, surplus, abundance, surfeit, waste, intemperance, and operating beyond the limits of custom or reason or law. I hope to have made the case for why, rather than trying to define fascist imperialism through a mere laundry list of traits like autarky, militarism, racial hierarchy, public works, mass violence, and so on, we can more usefully treat these as processes or aspects of excessification. In certain contexts, these processes refract a residue of imperial experiences, whereas at other moments they push the bounds of or exceed those experiences. At the same time, fascist imperialism itself enfolded the question of excess as abundance and waste into its guiding principles. Excess is thus also part of the story that fascist imperialism told about itself. I hope I've captured the dynamics of fascist empire as part and parcel of a larger imperial constellation that is simultaneously possessed of its own specificities and complex periodizations. In considering fascism's empires of excess, we might heed the words of anthropologist Catherine Nathaniel when she urges scholars to acknowledge the affect of unease that an inherently violent imperialism creates in us, both as scholars but as citizens of the world today. As she puts it, it's precisely with feelings of uncertainty, unease, and discomfort that we will work towards decolonial futures. So thank you for your attention and for the extra time.